After the Civil War, American culture and institutions underwent significant modernization. Units 5 through 9 address this phenomenon. Urbanization, the rise of cities, and urban culture rapidly grew after 1870. Populations of well and long-established cities such as New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia exploded, while other urban centers such as Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago emerged as commercial and industrial centers. Industrialization pulled rural Americans and immigrants to these urban centers. However, not all found urban industrial life easy. Urban ethnic ghettos were overcrowded and often served as breeding grounds for disease and despair. Unit 5 covers these topics. Many of those who labored in the factories and mines came from overseas. Between 1880 and 1924, the United States witnessed its largest immigration wave ever. However, the people who arrived and the places from which they came differed from those of earlier immigration waves. Consequently, these new immigrants faced discrimination and produced a backlash that yielded the National Origins Acts of 1921 and 1924. These acts virtually closed entrance into the United States for the next 40 years. Immigration is the topic of Unit 6. The arrival of new immigrants was part of a larger transformation of American society. By the 1920s, blacks, youth, and women challenged traditional roles and stereotypes. At the same time, American culture modernized. Cars, jazz, and movies provided Americans with leisure activities never seen. These are the topics of Unit 7. Finally, modernization, especially of the U.S. economy, did not come about without producing problems. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and Americans endured a 12-year-long economic downturn that forever changed their lives and the culture of the United States. To resolve the social and economic problems, the federal government created the New Deals. These increased the size and the power of the federal government and are the subjects of Unit 8. Modernization transformed the United States. As a consequence of rapid industrialization, the United States became an economic world power by the early 20th century. This produced greater involvement in overseas affairs such as World Wars I and II. The emergence of new immigrants challenged national identity. Many Americans began to question who they were and what the nation would become with their arrival. The arrival of the new immigrants and the emergence of the new black and new women produced tensions between more traditional Americans and the new modern American lifestyle. It produced one of the most acute generational conflicts that the United States would witness in the 1920s. All of these things produced a conservative backlash. The Ku Klux Klan grew and rose outside of the American South. We also see the rise of the FBI and the conflict between religion and science in the famous 1925 Scopes monkey trial. Economic modernization also produced a Great Depression and the New Deals, and as stated earlier, both transformed the size and the power of the federal government. Modernization of American life, in part, occurred as the rise of cities. Until 1910, the majority of Americans lived on farms and made their living in agriculture. However, with the rise of industrialization and the rise of cities, by 1910, more Americans lived in towns and cities than ever before, and would continue to do so from 1910 on. There are three factors that led to the growth of U.S. population and to American cities, the first of which involved migration from rural America to urban centers like Chicago. Chicago was, in the 19th century, America's fastest growing city, and many Americans believed that it would eventually surpass New York City as the most populated and most urban center. Like today, it was jobs that attracted Americans from rural centers to the cities. Jobs in railroad, steel, oil, and garment industries drew Americans to places like Chicago, New York City, and Philadelphia. Many were also attracted by what they perceived to be the new freedoms of urban life. And urban centers attracted consumers and youth who found vaudeville, department stores, and Coney Island exciting diversions. Immigration also attracted population from overseas. This is a discussion we'll have in Unit 6. The third factor that led to population growth and to the rise of cities involved longer lifespans. In 1900, the average American only lived to the age of 40, half of what the current lifespan is. Today we live to about 80 to 83. The reason for their short lifespans had to do with death in infancy and from childhood diseases. It also had to do with poor public health. By the end of the 19th century, American cities are starting to witness improvements stemming from scientific and public health innovation. Listerine, an antiseptic, killed germs that today cause bad breath, but then prevented post-surgical infection that oftentimes led to the death of many Americans. Pasteurization of milk made it safer to store and to drink. By the late 19th century, the United States witnessed the creation of the American Medical Association, which professionalized American medicine. It required better and more training of its doctors. In urban centers, refrigeration of food made food safer to eat and produce less waste. And finally, by the middle of the 20th century, Americans saw the rise of immunization and the cut down of death from polio and measles. American parents and their children began to live longer and healthier lives that contributed to population growth and the rise of the cities. As the population of the United States grew and cities emerged, the culture of cities was transformed to better meet consumer needs and to fill the increasingly free time that urban residents found themselves to have. One of the first areas of modernization occurred in the realm of shopping. Traditionally, most Americans lacked disposable income to purchase many consumer goods. Most of the goods they did buy were perishables, like food, that had to be bought daily. Poor immigrant residents shopped in their neighborhoods, locally and daily, from street carts and vendors. As a consequence, they developed friendly and daily relationships with the sellers of these goods. Occasionally, when one needed to buy non-perishable items like cloth, glass, and grains, they shopped at what were called dry goods stores. Farmers oftentimes came to these dry goods stores to buy such items as well as farm equipment. Dry goods stores usually consisted of 2 stories and were often the tallest and largest building in small towns. It's out of these dry goods stores that department stores emerged. Department stores like Macy's in New York City offered consumers a variety of goods at a single site and made shopping convenient as well as a leisure activity for middle-class women. Department stores grew as the result of several factors. The mechanization of production and the growth of factories allowed goods to be mass-produced and sold at affordable prices. This did, however, mean that goods like clothing were no longer made by the tailor for an individual customer, but were mass-produced using standardized sizes. By the mid to late 19th century, America also had witnessed the growth of the middle class. It is the middle class and upper classes who possess the disposable income with which to buy consumer goods at the department stores. Finally, goods produced in the East Coast and the Ohio Valley factories had to find a quick, cheap way to get to the consumers in the cities. Transportation innovation in the early to mid-19th century and the growth of the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads enabled these goods to get to the cities and to the department stores where the consumers resided. Department stores were huge and multiple-storied, as you can see here. Each department store was divided according to floor and on each floor into separate departments, hence the name department store. What initially attracted shoppers to these stores were the lavish window displays. On the first floor, one usually saw menswear. Busy men did not want to take the time to look through the levels and the departments for their goods. They wanted to get in and out quickly. As a consequence, menswear oftentimes was located on the first floor. Most of these stores on the East Coast had basements. This is where irregulars and sale items were stored. Unlike today, when sales are usually weekly, sales then were annual or biannual, and big events. Oftentimes, this was the only time that immigrant poor could afford to shop at a department store because of sale prices. But for middle-class women who shopped on a regular basis and saw shopping as a leisure activity, after a long day of shopping, they recreated in the tea rooms that were oftentimes located at the very top of the stores. During these tea breaks, fashion shows were oftentimes produced to entertain these middle and upper class women. While middle and upper class women shopped at the stores, it was the working class women who labored in these stores. These were known as the pink collar laborers. Unlike the men in the middle class who wore white collars to work, and working class men who usually wore denim shirts and blue collars, these pink collar laborers didn't necessarily wear pink collars, but were females and single. They were attracted by the higher paying and higher status jobs provided in the department stores. To work at a department store, however, one's dress and manners had to be impeccable. Employers often provided affordable housing for these laborers, but required that their residents and employees strictly adhere to the rules that they set forth and to the curfews that they laid down. Employers wanted a reliable employee who showed up on time, ready to work. They did not want a young lady who had been out the night before and was groggy and cranky. Most of these clerks tended to be Anglo and not immigrant in origin. Pink-collar workers found work in department stores, but also were the secretaries in business offices and served as stenographers in factories. While during the day urban residents worked and shopped, at night they discovered other diversions. The most popular of these diversions was vaudeville. Vaudeville was most popular between 1881, where it originated in New York City, to about 1920. Eventually, by 1920, movies began to attract Americans and less began to attend vaudeville shows. However, vaudeville was indeed an attraction for not only working but middle-class residents. In order to attract the middle class, however, vaudeville would have to clean up its act. One of the origins of vaudeville came from burlesque. Burlesque shows were performed in taverns and tended to attract males. Between acts, scantily dressed women paraded up and down the aisles. For vaudeville to attract middle-class families, these acts would have to be cleaned up, and they were. Old world culture, such as English and Yiddish theater, brought over by immigrants, also provided the source of vaudeville shows. At home, many of the origins came from circus freak acts of Barnum and Bailey. Animal acts and juggling originated from these circus acts and found their way into vaudeville. Vaudeville did combine old and new world culture and produce a new synthetic as well as a modern culture. Vaudeville, as noted, consisted of variety shows. There were usually 10 to 12 acts. Usually the worst went first, and eventually the anticipation grew for the best shows. The best acts usually performed in acts 10 through 12. As the anticipation grew, the audience became more excited. They saw performers like Milton Berle, Al Jolson, Charlie Chaplin, and Bert Lahr. These individuals became some of the most loved and well-known performers of American pop culture in the 20th century. Charlie Chaplin came from England, got his origins in vaudeville, and eventually would go on to star in silent films. He was well known both in and outside of the United States. Al Jolson, whom you see here, was a Russian Jewish immigrant who made it big in vaudeville. He eventually, because of the radio, went on to perform songs and starred in the 1927 first feature-length film, The Jazz Singer. As you can see here, he performs part of his act in blackface. This suggests the vaudeville had minstrel origins that we've talked about. Also a well-loved and well-known performer was Bert Lahr, as you can see here. You probably are more familiar with his most famous role as the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. And Milton Berle, Uncle Melty, Mr. TV, went on to star in a variety show in the early days of television. His Melton Berle variety show was widely attractive to 1950s and early 60s Americans. Vaudeville wasn't the only source of diversion and entertainment in turn-of-the-century America. The American movie industry, which I'll later discuss, originated in the late 19th century and consisted of Nickelodeons. These were storefront theaters where patrons viewed moving reels through a visor. Many of the subjects were off-color in nature and consisted of naked women. Like vaudeville, Nickelodeons and early cinema would have to clean up its act before it became widely popular and mass-consumed. If one did not go to vaudeville or Nickelodeons, one could go to taverns. At these taverns, oftentimes music was performed by local entertainers who usually tinkled out some sort of tune on the piano. Ragtime emerged at these taverns and provided entertainment for locals in urban centers. Also emerging because of mass leisure and industrialization were the amusement parks. In Brooklyn, Coney Island became one of the most famous and still is one of the most famous in America today. At Coney Island, or the Boardwalk of Atlantic City on the East Coast, or Long Beach and Santa Cruz West Coast boardwalks, Americans of the turn of the century spent their hot summer days on the beaches in the water recreating. They rode the Ferris wheels and the roller coasters at these boardwalks and played carnival games where prizes could be won. Department stores, vaudeville, Nickelodeons, and amusement parks provided urban Americans with new ways to spend their money and their free time. They ultimately contributed also to the rise and the growth of American mass popular culture.